So another quiet week on the Hill, nothing much to talk about. Just a verbal slugfest like no other we've witnessed in years, some of it aimed directly at the highest office in the land. Chantal and Bruce are here at the table tonight. Andrew joins us from Ottawa. It really, we've all seen a lot of wild weeks in Ottawa. This was unlike most that we've ever seen. Chantal?
The wildest certainly since the parliamentary crisis. I saw something I'd not seen in a long, long time. Took a plane in mid-afternoon and there was a television set in the waiting area to board the flight. And I thought, why are people all crowded in one section? There are plenty of seats and people were actually standing around and sitting around watching question period.
You don't see that often.
I don't think I'd ever seen that.
Yeah. Andrew, you spent most of the week in Ottawa, but it's been a crazy time.
Well, and it was a question period or two that were actually worth watching, I think, is the sum total of that. I mean, we can get into all the haranguing and the name calling, et cetera, but there was also some very probing questions and on occasion some answers from the Prime Minister. That should be counted as a good week in some ways. Bruce?
Yeah, in every city that I was in several of them this week, I had the same experience that Chantal is describing. Lots of people really interested in politics to an extent that they haven't been before. We've talked about a lot of issues over the last year or two. We were kind of wondering why the public wasn't tuning in. Well, they are tuning in now. All
right. Well, Andrew mentioned the exchanges with the Prime Minister. I want to play a bit of the back and forth today between the NDP leader, Tom Mulcair, and the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, because it highlights a couple of things. As we saw earlier in the newscast, Terry Malofsky talking about the change in what the Prime Minister says now about the number of people who knew about the deal, the Duffy-Wright deal. But watch this.
After firing Nigel Wright, the Prime Minister told Canadians in this House that absolutely no one else, not a few, no one else knew about the deal between Duffy and Wright. Now he admits that top Conservatives actually did know about the scheme, but they kept him in the dark knowingly, and they allowed him to make false statements to Parliament. But if that's true, why didn't he fire any of them?
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Wright made this decision. He has been very clear. He informed very few people.
What's been proven to be false and turned out to be false is that no one else knew about it when 13 people knew about it, and he hasn't fired anybody.
Mr. Speaker, he alleges that many people knew about this. That is simply not correct. This was Mr. Wright's decision, using his own resources and by his own admission, documented. He told very few people. The solution is not to have senators or anybody else pretend they're nonpartisan. It is to have them elected so they're accountable to the Canadian people.
How's that going, the elected Senate? They've had a bill about Senate reform on the books for 2 years. You know how many times they've called it? 0.
Tom Mulcair, in a way, we haven't seen him, I don't think, since he's become leader of the NDP. Andrew, let's deal with the Prime Minister, first of all, because a definite change in the way he looks back now in terms of who knew what and when.
Yes. Well, and a change in his tone and his willingness to answer questions on this. I think he had a good day the day before this when he was actually starting to engage some of the things that Mike Duffy said. I think he saw an opening for himself to turn this into Duffy versus Harper, ethical Prime Minister versus expense-padding senators. But that also makes him very much the focus, and there are these lingering doubts, shall we say, to say the least, about his story that he never knew anything about the deal with Duffy. And the more people who did know, and the more news stories and speeches, et cetera, that come out naming people who knew, it doesn't make it impossible that he didn't know, but it makes it more improbable. And this is obviously great ground for Tom Mulcair in his sort of lawyerly fashion, going after some of those gaps and contradictions.
Chantal, how did you see the Prime Minister on this performance?
I agree with Andrew. I was in the House yesterday and he had a better day, and he also wisely decided that no one else could stand in this place, and if only as an act of mercy, a rare one this week, gave his parliamentary secretary a break and answered the questions himself. But you feel even when he looks like he's giving more answers, that he's skating on such a tiny rink that at some point he's always against, the boards. And Mulcair can see that too. And today you saw an example of that this was the Prime Minister forever hitting one of his boards, and Mulcair very much enjoying it. I would say today that the person in control was the leader of the opposition and not the Prime Minister, and that's very rare in the history of Stephen Harper.
Well, when you have to change a major plank of your story, which the Prime Minister did today, it's a difficult day.
Well, he had to change up the strategy. Clearly, the strategy that they were employing wasn't working. It wasn't only not working, it was hurting them. And so it was, you know, the Prime Minister had been accused by Mr. Duffy of a number of things, and for him not to answer questions directly, not to show some anger at the things that were being said about him, would have made more people wonder, I think, about why the silence, why the deferral of the questions to anybody else. This was probably the first time that I can recall seeing the Prime Minister, who's quite an effective question period performer for the most part, be bested by Tom Mulcair. Tom Mulcair was not just as good as he's been, he was better than he's ever been and better than we've seen in a long time in the House. So as the days unfold going forward, we're going to be seeing a very interesting and high level, high quality of debate in the House of Commons, I think.
Well, where does the week come to an end with the Prime Minister? I mean, his people are all running around saying he's back, he's on top of his game, he's looking good. How much of that is real? There's no doubt he had a better week than he's had lately, but is he, you know, is he ahead now on the story? Where is he? Was it a win week for Stephen Harper?
I don't think I would call it that yet. I think that if everything that he said today and yesterday was the whole truth, then it really begs the question, why wouldn't he have said it over the last several months? I mean, barring the one thing where he said, yes, some more people knew, and I said nobody knew. It's also, I think, fair to wonder, if everything that he said in the last 2 days was the whole truth, then what does he have to fear from giving these senators a hearing, the hearing that they're asking for in the Senate? There remain a number of really important questions, most of which Tom Mulcair covered today, and I think need to get answered.
Andrew, do you want in on that?
Let me come back to something I was saying originally. You know, this whole thing, even beyond the question of the check to Duffy and the who knew what about it, overarching this is, are we going to have a single ethical standard that applies to people in public office that's applied impartially, or is it going to be a sort of a sliding scale that depends on whether you're in or out with the Prime Minister? And when the Prime Minister rounded on Duffy yesterday and said, "You're darn right, I demanded he repay the expenses," what he was really saying was, I am the standard and I am the enforcer. Well, as soon as you make yourself the center of that issue, then people start saying, well, then why didn't you enforce this sooner? Why did Duffy and Wall and these other senators wander all over Canada on the public dime campaigning for the Conservatives? Why didn't you do anything about that then? Why did you only start to do it when they were becoming a liability? And as similarly, when people start saying, if you demanded that he that he repaid the expenses, you were clearly involved in the file. How were you not involved with some of the other things that we know were going on? So I think while he was looking better and more in command, he's also made himself more the target.
All right, I want to deal with this rule of law, due process question that a lot of people are raising in terms of whether the senators should be suspended without more hearings, without some opportunity for defense. How concerned should Canadians be about that, Chantal?
They should be very concerned. This is not about the Conservative Party overseeing its own and deciding that it does not want people to be in their caucus, that they have lost the confidence of caucus and they're not going to be there anymore. This is about the government majority deciding who is fit to sit in the Senate on the basis of a political judgment that can't be measured by the presumption of innocence, by a full hearing of the fact, by broken laws. And that should be, I think, a major concern to anyone, not just because the Conservatives are doing it today, but because it sets a precedent that is based on no lines that are not political. What if you decide one day that we have a huge unity crisis and the majority in the House of Commons decides it doesn't want sovereignness there? How does that work? And we've seen moments in the history of this country where reason comes way back after passion. So I don't think you want to open the door to things like that.
Bruce?
I agree. I think it's a very serious precedent-setting question. I think that more Canadians are paying attention to it with each hour almost as this political crisis has unfolded. I think that there have been, you know, the Prime Minister obviously made a very strong case for throw these people out of the Senate. They don't deserve to be on the payroll one more day than is absolutely necessary. But senators, Conservative senators, Plett and Siegel, have also made very eloquent speeches saying, we don't need to rush this. We should follow some sort of due process here. I think if it's going to take us 3 or 4 more days before the Senate gets to a vote, I think Canadians should pay attention to this debate. And if they have a point of view, either throw them out or give them a hearing, they should let their senators know.
Andrew?
Yes, there's certainly a matter of fairness to the individuals involved and due process, but I think it's more, again, what's the standard? It's hard to have too much sympathy for the individuals involved here because while they fell short, I think, of any standard that most of us would think was proper in normal life, they just didn't seem to fall short of the standards of the Senate because it doesn't appear to have been much standards. If they were, they weren't very well enforced. So I think the larger question is, what are the rules? Should they be applied in an impartial way, or are we just simply seeking vengeance on people who were kind of in the way?
We have a justice system and we have justice principles that are not based on whether you are sympathetic or not. That's why we have them. They are based on the presumption of innocence and due process. And neither of those criteria are met by what is happening in the Senate this week. And the notion that the Conservative Party is cleaning house does not apply. These people are no longer the responsibility of the Conservative Party. They don't sit in their caucus.
I want to show you another clip from today. Mulcair was clearly scoring points at the Prime Minister's expense. And at one point, the Prime Minister had this in response. Watch this.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member is now just starting to throw mud without any facts whatsoever. I look at the NDP and I remember the old saying, the more you throw mud, the more you lose ground.
This was from the party that destroyed Stéphane Dion with mud in ads, Michael Ignatieff with mud in ads, and went after Bob Rae with mud in ads. What's the difference?
Someone was also saying that this was a saying that Jean Chrétien had once used in similar circumstances.
Mm-hmm. You're nodding there, Andrew?
It was, indeed. I remember him saying it. It's a little too practiced aligned. I've never found it a particularly useful piece of rhetoric. It's a little too clever for its own good. But certainly we should all be careful of being too loose with accusations. But we can also be I don't know, too defensive about these things, which it seems to be he was.
Okay, we've all talked about what an amazing kind of week this was and how it's one that we're not going to forget. We don't know where this story's going. It's clearly not over yet. It keeps building legs as opposed to losing them. But when we look back, what does this week represent in terms of our system, our politics, our parliament? What is the marker for this week? Bruce?
Well, I think we've had an outbreak of some of the most vicious and visceral personal politics than we've ever seen. I can't recall another situation where we've had powerful personalities saying the most directly, personally challenging things, like we've heard even later today, Senator Le Breton talking about Senator Wallen and Senator Duffy. So that's really quite extraordinary. Normally politics is so much about packaging and narrow scripting of messages, so this is really quite unusual. How it turns out will tell us something about whether or not the disengagement that we've all sensed of Canadians towards politics for the last couple of years is changing now, that there is a circumstance that's brought about a renewal of interest and a passion for finding the right solutions.
A minute left. Andrew?
Arbitrary power arbitrarily applied. We've given so much power to the Prime Minister and our system to be judge and jury, and in particular in this case of his own members of his party, some of whom are clearly resenting his exercise of that power. The good news, if there's any in this week, is the revival of question period. That was a Prime Minister who was really under fire and really being held to account for a couple of days there, and we should celebrate that part of it.
Chantal, you get the last word.
I think the capital of moral authority of the Prime Minister is going to be severely diminished as a result of this, and as a result of an accumulation of this kind of expedient rushing to judgment. And it struck me this week that Conservatives did a lot of damage to Conservatives while the rest of us watched, and that can't be good news for a ruling party that is fractious at the best of times.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Andrew's in Ottawa. Thanks, Andrew. Chantal and Bruce here in Toronto.